Okay, everybody, it is time for another tier list. This time we're going to be talking about the topic of sophomore albums. Sophomore albums are an interesting one because, you've heard this thing about the sophomore slump, right? Meaning that oftentimes bands come out with the first album and it's awesome and everybody loves it. The question is, can they do it for a second time? This is oftentimes where bands like kind of make it or break it. So either their second album ends up being like a way better version of the first album that was already good, or it sucks and everyone's like, okay, I guess they only had one good album in them and they sort of try to ride the wave forever. Either way, we shall see. We shall see what the sophomore album tier list has in store for us. And also, I wanted to mention something new that I'm doing, which is a YouTube coaching program. If you're an individual creator or you're a company, really anybody that wants to grow on YouTube, this is for you. Basically, this is a way to download everything that I have learned about YouTube over the past 7 years from my brain into yours. There's a pretty common set of challenges that pretty much everybody runs into on YouTube. I've run into pretty much all of them. And with this coaching program, I can help you get past those a lot faster than I did figuring it out on my own. For example, in my opinion, the single most important thing for any channel is figuring out the right niche for your content. Like, what should you focus on and how do you talk about it? For example, for me on this channel, once I found that, I went from getting, a couple hundred views a video to tens of thousands of views per video, literally almost overnight. You can see it right here. And also the right approach to things like titles and thumbnails and how to structure your videos to keep people's attention. All that stuff that took me years to figure out on my own through trial and error. I just want to help you speed run all of that. I am super excited about this, and I'm going to be putting a lot of time and energy into it over the course of the year. And if you want to find out more about it, you can just hit the link in the description of this video. The first one, of course, you know that there's no way that I could possibly make a video without talking about nu metal. So here it is. Significant Other by Limp Bizkit. I think that $3 bill, y'all, is bad. I've talked about this before. I think it's bad. It's hard to listen to. I understand, if you were like 11 years old when $3 bill, y'all came out, and maybe before that you were listening to, I don't know, Barney or something like that, and you heard $3 bill, y'all, maybe you thought it was amazing, but a little bit rough around the edges if you ask me. But Significant Other, a very, 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 very big step up from their first album, in my opinion. And, I'm not the world's biggest Limp Bizkit fan, but I think objectively we can say, as far as sophomore albums go, I think we got to put it up on the S tier. Commercial success, everybody loves it now. Easy call to put on the S tier, I think. Now, how about another album that I think maybe didn't hold up quite so well? Pretty Odd by Panic at the Disco. Let's listen to it really quick. So everybody, of course, knows the first album, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, because it's great. One of the most iconic emo albums of the 2000s. But a lot of people maybe slept on this album because it's a little weird. So sorry we've been gone. A little weird. It's kind of weird. This is when they, kind of got into the Beatles and the Beach Boys and stuff, and it's not bad. Yeah, it sounds like kids' music. Yeah, it's a little bit weird. It's not bad, but it's a little bit weird. It's certainly not what I think a lot of people wanted from them, but it's not bad. Certainly not compared to some of the other stuff we're going to listen to. So I would put this on the C tier, I think. Like, I would never choose to listen to it, and I think it was quite a disappointment, but I can't objectively say it's bad or anything like that. Yeah, it wanted to be Sgt. Pepper's in some parts. That's right. And listen, they were still really young when they did that, like 19 or 20, something like that. So yeah, I think C tier is fair. Sounds like an album circus clowns put on to fuck to. Well, that's what I would have said about Mr. Bungle, but I could see this one too. Fair assessment. Next up, once again, plumbing the depths of the 2000s. I think some people are going to be unhappy with me about this one, but we have the second album by your boys in Under Oath. Look at that streaky, like, long exposure photography with that like late 90s, early 2000s typography. Vintage. A lot of people think of this as their first album because their actual first album was pretty hard to find, but it is indeed not their first album. The real first album is this one, Active Depression, from back when they were still a pro-life Christian deathcore band. It's pretty good though. Pretty good. This shit's good, right? Pretty good. Listen to that snare too. Changing the Times is where they changed things up quite a bit. They went from playing that like brutal, that song is the one where he goes like, you should have thought of that baby before you had sex. Now, to everybody's surprise, they got, what's his name, Tim on guitar, who I think was sort of the emo guy, and got a whole new style. Then they came out sounding like this. Just a couple years later, like, wait a minute. They went emo. What? Can't say it's great. I mean, They're Only Chasing Safety, I think, is a fantastic album, and you can kind of see where they're headed with it on this album, but I think it's not quite there. Personally, I think it's not quite there. So I would say this album, with all due respect to the folks in Under Oath, I would put it on the C tier with Pretty Odd. I see where they were going with it, but I'm not sure that I would say it's fantastic. I think it's just kind of, I think it's okay. That's what I think. Okay, but not fantastic. Now, I did a search here for the Blink album, and I got a Google ad for actual dude ranches. Did you know that these are a thing? I did not. I forgot that a dude ranch was an actual thing. I thought it was just an album. It turns out it's an actual thing. And I'll tell you my favorite thing about this album. Let's take a look at the cover art here. And you guys guess what my favorite thing about this album is. Can you guess? What do you think it is? What do you think my favorite thing about this album is? Can you guess? I'll give you a look. That's the best thing about this album right here. The two best things about this album. It's an interesting one because this was the first Blink album that I got, and I liked it quite a bit at the time. If this was the last thing that they had ever released, I probably would think it was great. The problem is that the album after it was Enema of the State, which in my opinion is the best pop punk album ever made. And the one before this was like good. Dude Ranch, obviously better. So it's kind of a tough one because if this was their only album, I would probably rank it like very high. The problem is that by comparison to Enema of the State, it's like, I don't know. It's like, it's like they did so much better with their next album that it made this one look bad. The drumming on this one isn't great. I agree with that too. And I know that every time this comes up, there's the Scott hipsters, that want to punish me for it and say that Scott was the better drummer. It's not true. It's not true. If this album was recorded with Travis on drums, it would probably be like a whole letter higher, I think. Now, I do like the album quite a bit. I think B is fair. Maybe A. I don't know. What do you think? A or B tier? What do you guys think? A, B. You know what? I'll put it on the A tier because I do like it. I do like it. It's a fun album. Now, we got to have something in here that, well, let's just say this was an odd choice. So you guys know Bad Religion, right? And you know what Bad Religion sounds like? Bad Religion, of course, sounds like this. Everyone knows what Bad Religion sounds like, right? Right? Sounds like this. But did you know that their second album, Into the Unknown, for some reason they decided to like make whatever, like this weird progressive rock album when they were like 17 or 18 years old or something like that, and definitely not capable of playing this kind of music. I don't know what possessed them to do this. They were like, what, 17 or 18 years old or something like that at the time. And I'm sure Brett has talked about like why they chose to do this. I'm not sure what the reason was. And I know that they don't think it was great either because this album like went out of print almost immediately and it was like impossible to find. I feel like they may have reissued it or something kind of recently, but it was like impossible to find this album for like decades because I think they sort of just didn't want it to exist. And I understand why. Because, not fantastic. Let's put it that way. At a time when most LA bands were playing extremely fast, stripped-down rock, Bad Religion released this chunk of 70s-style hard rock that anticipated the 70s revival by about a decade. It's a bit off-putting at first blush, mainly because the tempos are slower and more deliberate. So you know that if the guy in the band, his label said it's a bit off-putting at first blush, you know that says a lot. So I'm sorry. With all due respect to the fellas in Bad Religion, I think they're awesome. Great band, but this belongs in the F tier. I'm sorry. It's not good. Listen, nobody bats 1,000. Respect Bad Religion, but album goes on the F tier. Let's talk about an album that obviously you guys know that I'm going to love, which is the second studio album by Hatebreed entitled Perseverance, which, if you ask me, one of the best hardcore albums of all time. It's actually not my favorite Hatebreed album, but I do like it, although it is not my favorite Hatebreed album. It does have some of their best songs. I think most people think this is the best Hatebreed album, and I think that's a valid opinion, although I do not share it. But let's check it out for anybody who hasn't heard it. This song is one of the best hardcore songs ever written, no question about that. I love it. This is back when hardcore bands barely even had music videos, too. Yeah, this video is hard, isn't it? Now, like I said, not my favorite Hatebreed album, although I do love it. I feel like this 3-album run of Perseverance, Rise of Brutality, and the self-titled album by Hatebreed, I think are like kind of untouchable. I think all 3 of them are just absolutely like flawless. I think the self-titled Hatebreed album is my favorite, which I know is sort of a controversial opinion, but listen. It's my list. I can put it where I want. That said, even though this is not my favorite Hatebreed album, I still think it's great. And for me personally, I'm going to put it on the S tier because yes, I think Blink and Hatebreed, 2 of my favorite bands. Doesn't get any better than that. For anybody who's asked, my favorite bands, I think, are Blink-182, A Day to Remember, Hatebreed, The Vandals, and probably 311, I think. I've listened to a whole lot of 311. I never talk about them on the internet because I feel like everybody hates them, but I love 311. I put them in one of my favorite bands of all time. Okay, next up, we have Waking the Fallen by Avenged Sevenfold, which is their second album. First album, Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, is bad. I'm sorry. Sorry to my friends in Avenged Sevenfold, lovely guys, but the first album, not good. Waking the Fallen is the first Avenged Sevenfold album with their real lineup. Brian, Sinister Gates, was not in the band on the first album. He only played on, I think, 1 song on the first album. And it's not really Avenged Sevenfold without Brian in the band. And so this is the album where their sound really started to come together. I feel like this is sort of a hipster opinion these days, is that Waking the Fallen is their best album. I disagree with that. I think it's fine, but I think it's pretty far from their best stuff. City of Evil is a flawless 10 out of 10 masterpiece. I think the self-titled is also a 10 out of 10 masterpiece. Waking the Fallen, I think, is, not the best, but still really good. I actually don't like the screaming. I know a lot of people say that Avenged Sevenfold sucked when they stopped playing metalcore and stopped screaming. I actually disagree. I don't think that they sounded good with screaming, and that's not like Matt was a perfectly good screamer. I just don't really think it just didn't sound right to me. Like, for them to play metalcore just sort of, I don't know. Avenged Sevenfold is not metalcore to me. They're like weird, progressive, whatever the fuck they are, I think. And so for this reason, I absolutely love Avenged Sevenfold, and I do think this album is good, but I would put it on the B tier, personally. Next up, we have 2. This is going to be a tough one, I think. Let's talk about a back-to-back nu metal pairing. I feel like this is probably the hottest debate of which is better, Meteora or Iowa. Let's talk about Meteora. Meteora is S tier. I agree with that. Meteora is better than Hybrid Theory. I think that's a toss-up. I personally like Hybrid Theory better, although I think you could certainly make a reasonable case that Meteora is the better album. Really just sort of depends what you like. I think they took the sound of Hybrid Theory and perfected it. I think that's true, but there's something about Hybrid Theory just being a little bit more, a little bit less polished, I think, is why I like Hybrid Theory a little bit better, is specifically because it's a little bit less polished. But I think it's entirely reasonable if you like Meteora better. I think that's totally fair. They're both fantastic. Maybe it's just because I actually liked Hybrid Theory when it came out. I listened to it like a pretty good amount. And by the time Meteora came out, I sort of just didn't really care about Linkin Park anymore. Not that I didn't like them, but I just kind of didn't really care about them anymore. So I don't know. For me personally, Hybrid Theory was a much more kind of, that's an album that I cared about a lot more. But I would objectively say that Meteora belongs in the S tier just because, just because it does, because it's Meteora. And let's talk about its companion around the same time, Iowa by Slipknot. Obviously, I think everybody can agree that this is a timeless masterpiece. This is one of those albums that I think has really stood the test of time, and It's interesting because if you asked somebody in 2001 what the opinion of Slipknot would be 20 years later, 25 years later almost, I mean, I've said this a million times, so I'm going to say it again. At the time, Slipknot was like the least credible band. Like the only band that was like more poserish than Slipknot probably would be Limp Bizkit. I remember at the time I was like trying to like start a band, and I met some guy off of Craigslist who played drums, and I asked him what kind of music he liked, and he was like, well, I kind of like Slipknot. Like he was like embarrassed to tell me that he liked Slipknot, and I was like, that's cool, I don't care. He was coming out to me as a Slipknot fan as though, you know, he'd be like, well, there's something you should know about me, you know, I like guys. And I'd be like, okay, that's cool. It doesn't bother me that you're gay. Like he was coming out to me as a Slipknot fan as though it was some sort of like deep, dark secret where he was like deeply worried about, you know, how I would judge him. And that's what you need to understand about how people thought about Slipknot at the time. And now obviously the way people think about Slipknot has completely changed. And now they're everyone's favorite band in the world, and for good reason. They were always great. Yeah, he told you that in confidence. How dare I betray his confidence all these years later? Yeah. So I'm sorry. I forget his name. He was a cool guy. I forget his name. But I'm sorry for outing you all these years later as a Slipknot fan. People want Slipknot to basically always recreate this album, but it's close to impossible to do that. This was the product of anger they no longer feel as humans. Yeah, I mean, I feel like in order for them to like properly recreate this album, they would have to be in an incredibly unhealthy, awful place that I'm sure none of them want to be in anymore. So yeah, if you like Slipknot, you actually should not want them to recreate this album because of what that would mean about their mental health. So yeah, I think it goes in the S tier. I think it's awesome. And now I'm going to break my own rules a little bit here, which is typically I don't consider EPs to be albums, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I want to talk about the Lies EP by Guns N' Roses, which was the follow-up to their debut album, Appetite for Destruction. And Appetite for Destruction, as I've said before, in my opinion, is one of the absolute best pieces of music in any kind of genre ever created. I think it is like a god-tier classic. 10 out of 10. There is not a single moment on Appetite for Destruction that is anything other than a 10. It's absolutely perfect. Now, how about Lies? How about Lies? I feel like it's kind of mistaken. You don't hear people talking about Lies very much. And I think it's pretty damn good. It's definitely different in the sense that like a lot of it is acoustic. You know, some of those songs, I don't know, like Used to Love Her is kind of weird. And I don't usually like acoustic stuff, but there's something about Lies that it just tells you that Guns N' Roses is so goddamn good that even when they do an acoustic, mostly acoustic EP that, you know, kind of flew under the radar a little bit, you know, among the fandom, it's still pretty goddamn good. It's not Appetite, but it's still a really good album. That's what I feel about it. Patience was a really, really, really big hit off of this EP. I think Patience was like probably almost as big as like Paradise City, maybe not quite, but that was a really big song. And then of course, you know, we've got The Elephant in the Room. Yeah, 1 in a Million is genuinely cringy in a way that's impossible to replicate in 2024. It's almost magically tone deaf. It really is. Like 1 in a Million is just like shockingly yeah, tone deaf is a good word for it. I'm going to say that Lies, I don't think is A tier, but it's better than people sort of realize. I would say it's B tier. I think it's pretty damn good. And I didn't really like Use Your Illusion all that much. I thought it was okay, but not great. I think Lies is the last thing Guns N' Roses put out that, you know, I really feel good about giving my stamp of approval to. That does it, people. That's the sophomore album tier list. There you have it. Join me next time for the next edition where you can argue with me and tell me how wrong all my opinions are. And there it is. That's the best thing about this album right here.